It's the Worth Knowing live stream on my Substack, Worth Knowing with Matt Robeson. I'm Matt Robeson, but also simultaneously on the Cliff's Edge channel on YouTube. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, LinkedIn, and on the Substack belonging to today's special guest. And I want to introduce him in a minute. But first, I want to set up today's theme because it's incredibly important. There are a few things in life, like going to see an expert when the chips are down and getting some good news. Your doctor runs some medical tests on you and walks into the exam room with a smile on her face. Or your car mechanic takes a look at the damage from your fender bender and says, no big deal. I can bang that out. I have an old friend who's a public defender who once walked into his office and told a new client that after reviewing her case, he thought she was in the least trouble of any client he'd ever had. She hugged him. I mean, wouldn't you? So it was pretty damn uplifting to tune into the Substack live stream Monday night, last night, from former assistant U.S. attorney and NBC, MSNBC legal analyst, Glenn Kirschner, and hear him say, I am feeling optimistic today. Now, optimism has not been in abundant supply recently, and with good reason. The economy is down. Prices are up. War continues to rage in Ukraine. We mark today the 2-year anniversary of the October 7 attacks by Hamas that have spun into the terrible situation of ongoing Israeli hostages and untold deaths among Palestinians. Our rights and our freedoms are being taken away, along with our Tylenol and our vaccines. And at the root of all of it is a president who has created a post-rule of law America, as our guest from 3 weeks ago, the legal scholar Kim Whaley, put it. Because the whole point of the rule of law and the separation of powers is to prevent tyranny and to limit bad decisions. Now, America has, of course, made countless mistakes over the centuries, but we've been on a continual trajectory of self-improvement, the capacity for which is built into our system because we place strict limits on the ability of one person or one small group to drag us onto destructive paths or to limit our freedoms. Now, it's not that one political party has a monopoly on good ideas. It's that the rule of law is supposed to create a bulwark that makes abuses and folly harder to achieve and shorter lasting. And Donald Trump has blasted through all of that. So in that context, it's a real ray of light to hear from a true expert that there's a reason for optimism. And I want to hear more about it right now, including whether it's persisting through today. So let's welcome in former prosecutor, NBC and MSNBC legal analyst, Substack and YouTube star, Glenn Kirschner. Glenn, welcome.
Hey, Matt, great to be with you. And the only thing I'll tweak a little bit is I am a former MSNBC and NBC News legal analyst. I decided to ask to be released from my contract with MSNBC 6 months early. I was with them 6.5 years, decided it was time to be all independent all the time. I'm a journalism major by college education, and I decided it was time to be independent from corporate media, legacy media, because I am not ashamed, but I am concerned with the path that they've been on in recent years. So that's the only thing I would change in the intro.
And if I understand right, you partly wanted to not preach to the choir so much. You wanted to actually reach out to people who maybe needed to hear a slightly different voice than they're usually hearing.
Very much so. I wanted to talk across the great divide. And, you know, maybe that was a foolish decision. Maybe I was naive because, interestingly, one of my first attempts to do that, I was invited to speak to a conservative, a Republican conference, the Principles First Summit in Washington, D.C. at the JW Marriott. And the day I spoke, and it wasn't just me, it was lots of speakers, predominantly Republicans. The pipe bomb threats came in, the death threats came in, and there were a list of 12 people who, quote, deserve to die. I was one of them, and in the aftermath of that, there's been lots of threatened violence against me and my family. So, you know, I'm not going to stop trying to talk to all audiences, but you know, there are certainly consequences. We have learned to, you know, try to talk across that great divide and try to argue in favor of accountability for everyone who violates the law and the Constitution.
I want to also welcome in all the chatters and commenters who, as always, I will try to get your comments on screen. And I invite you, while we have a bona fide expert, I always like to do this. Go ahead, throw your questions at Glenn, at me, and we'll see if we can get to them. And I want to get right to a comment from MJ here, one of our favorite and most incisive commenters, that perhaps today Hopium is on deck. And I want to pump the brakes as you were doing, as we were chatting right before we went live. It was buoying. Is that a word? It was uplifting to hear that you had a sense of optimism yesterday. You're not as sure today. So tell us, if you would, why were you feeling more optimistic yesterday, and why are you maybe not as optimistic this morning?
Yeah, and if you're not figuratively speaking on a roller coaster, you're probably not paying attention. So, yesterday I thought it was a good day. Why? Because there were a series of important legal developments. One of the most important was the ruling by Judge Karen Immergut out in Oregon, when, she said something, 4 words that I think really kind of sum up Donald Trump's presidency, right? They could be on his tombstone when he leaves this earth. And that is, he is untethered to the facts. That pretty much sums up and defines Donald Trump's presidency. And that is especially true with the absurd claims that he is making to try to support a lawless and unconstitutional decision to militarize the streets of American cities. So it was not just her first temporary restraining order, Judge Immergut's, that was issued on an emergency basis after a hearing where the Trump administration Department of Justice officials who have been going into court and putting their licenses to practice law on the line because of the baseless, unsupportable, and often bad faith arguments they are making to federal court judges. And those arguments are getting them referred to their state bar for ethics investigations and possible sanctions. It wasn't just that, but it was her ruling that announced loud and clear that Donald Trump does not have the facts to support his claim that there is a basis to deploy the military National Guard or active United States military members to the streets of our cities. So that was an important ruling when she said, look, you don't have the goods to federalize the Oregon National Guards and deploy them to Portland. So what did the Trump administration do? It basically, tried to employ a workaround. I would call it violating the judge's order by saying, oh, okay, well, then we're going to take California National Guard troops or maybe Texas National Guard troops and send them to Portland, Oregon. First of all, this begins to feel like a violation of a state's sovereign rights. It also kind of smells like he's, trying to create some kind of a civil war between the states. But you know what? They got back into court in the dead of night. And she said, listen, first of all, I don't believe your argument that you thought this was a legitimate workaround. It's not. But let me clear things up in case you all have some reading comprehension deficits. I'm going to go ahead and issue another restraining order. No National Guard members from any state, including the District of Columbia, will be deployed to Oregon. Capiche? She didn't say capiche. I threw that in. So it was so important. And I just let her 31-page ruling wash over me as I was reading it. But the other development yesterday, Matt, was some news broke by my friends Carol Leonnig and Ken Delaney about how a career prosecutor with the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office has concluded that there is not even probable cause to indict New York Attorney General Letitia James. That is the system working. We see the horror show that is the leadership of the Department of Justice, my beloved home for nearly a quarter of a century. And the Pam Bondis and the Todd Blanches and the Lindsay Halligans, goodness help us all. We see the horror show of the DOJ leadership. But what we need to remember is there are tens of thousands of men and women who are still doing the hard work of the American people. They're representing the interests of the American people, not of the aspiring dictator in the Oval Office. And one of them, who was entrusted to investigate this alleged mortgage fraud claim against Tish James, had confided in some colleagues, and that news leaked out and was reported yesterday that no, or maybe the day before at this point, no, we will not be indicting. I will not be indicting Letitia James, which is the same answer that career DOJ prosecutors gave regarding the Jim Comey case. So Donald Trump had to, do this dirty workaround himself and send one of his flunkies into the grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia to twist arms. And mark my words, Matt, and I intend to be in court tomorrow at Jim Comey's arraignment. That case will fall apart spectacularly. And I can't wait, because it will expose Donald Trump for the paper tiger that he truly is, at least in as much as he can bloviate all day long about prosecuting his enemies, but he can't pull it off because he's really not very good at this dictating thing. I mean, the man couldn't keep a comedian off air for more than 1 week. You're not a very good dictator if you can't keep a comedian off TV. So I found several reasons to be optimistic yesterday. Another reason was Governor Pritzker in Illinois and his National Guard commander. When Donald Trump said, I'm going to federalize the Illinois National Guard, the commander said, the governor has decided it's not authorized, it's not necessary, and it's not appropriate. And so I am saying no. That is the first military pushback, albeit from a National Guard component, not from a U.S. troops component. But I think, and let me stop here so I don't filibuster. I think there's pushback inside the military. I was active duty Army JAG for 6.5 years before, and I probably would have stayed there for decades but you end up getting promoted out of the courtroom at about the 6 or 7 year mark. And I decided I never wanted to leave the courtroom. So instead, I left the Army JAG Corps and I joined the Department of Justice so I could try cases for the rest of my career. I think the thing that really gave me incredible optimism was that Hegseth and Trump clown show, the address to the troops, because I think that's solidified in the minds of every single military leader, from the officer corps, the chief warrant officer corps, and the NCO corps, that when Donald Trump said, I want you to use the American cities as training grounds to fight and win wars and to kill people and to get after the enemy from within, meaning the American people, I think that cemented in the minds of every military leader that this man is dangerously unfit to be commander-in-chief. They will begin, I hope, to act accordingly.
First of all, you are at no risk of filibustering on this show. I have to tell people that if you have not, this is me shilling, I'm shilling right now, but if you have not subscribed to Glenn's Substack, you should. There's something hypnotic about your nightly live streams. I don't know if it's the mellifluous quality of your voice or just sort of you can tell that you've spent decades as a courtroom prosecutor developing a flow and a punch to your arguments. And it comes across in every live stream that you do. So strongly recommended. And your information for your Substack is now right up on screen, along with mine. I'll shill for myself.
Thank you, Matt. Very kind.
Absolute true pleasure. And I just, let me go back. There was so much interesting stuff in what you just said, and we're going to circle back to a lot of it. So people in the chats, please do feel free to sting the points that you would like Glenn to expand on. But one thing you said there, the decision from the prosecutor in the Norfolk office, Elizabeth Yusi, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, the decision to say there is not even probable cause here. Could you just explain to us, that means that she is determining that this case doesn't even meet the lowest of embarrassingly low bars. Am I understanding that right?
It's such a great point, Matt, because, people hear, well, she's unwilling to indict. But I think folks should appreciate what that means in federal prosecutors speak. And here's what it means. There are lots of evidentiary burdens in the practice of criminal law. There is reasonable articulable suspicion. That's a very low level of suspicion when a police officer believes criminal activity is afoot, and it gives an officer just a fleeting moment to stop somebody. When you stop somebody, You're seizing them under the Fourth Amendment. But if you have reasonable articulable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot and you need to address it by questioning somebody in the street, you can momentarily, fleetingly seize them and ask them the question to either confirm or dispel your reasonable articulable suspicion. That's where we get the stop and frisk. Terry versus Ohio, stop and frisk, reasonable articulable suspicion. I'm not a huge fan of the stop and frisk, mind you. But then as you work your way up, we've got probable cause, we've got preponderance of the evidence, we've got clear and convincing evidence, and we have the mother of all burdens of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, right? That is the burden that applies if we want to convict somebody at trial. Probable cause, as you mentioned, is a relatively low standard. You just have to have some reliable evidence that one, a crime was committed, and two, a particular person committed it. It's less than 50% of the evidence. 50% is a preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not. That's a higher burden than probable cause. So that's why we hear people say, prosecutors can indict a ham sandwich in the grand jury, to which I always said, well, if the ham sandwich committed a crime, I could probably indict a ham sandwich. But what people should also know is a grand jury indictment is only as good as the ethics of the prosecutor urging the grand jury to indict. That's why when Lindsay Halligan, totally unqualified hack, went into the grand jury and told them to indict James Comey, I have a feeling we're going to end up piercing the veil of grand jury secrecy and seeing what she did in there. More to come on that, because Comey will be probably fronting a bunch of his motions tomorrow in court. But to go back to the probable cause, the legal standard to indict somebody is probable cause, relatively low. However, federal prosecutors are not allowed to seek an indictment on bare probable cause alone. We need to have enough admissible evidence such that we have a reasonable likelihood of success on the merits. In other words, we believe we can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. There's a huge chasm between probable cause and beyond a reasonable doubt. But if all we have and all we will ever have is probable cause, we should not be seeking an indictment. That's the way it works. So when Elizabeth Usey, who's a prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office, albeit the Norfolk satellite office of that office, which is based in Alexandria, Virginia, when it was reported that she concluded they didn't even have probable cause, in other words, she didn't commit a crime. We don't have the evidence to prove she committed a crime, not even by that low standard. That was huge. That was the death knell to the prospect of Tish James being indicted in the hands of an honest, ethical prosecutor. Now, will Lindsay Halligan jump in her car and drive from Alexandria to Norfolk and twist some arms in the grand jury again? Maybe. We're gonna know. We're gonna know right quick.
Boy, I shouldn't laugh at that. It is deadly serious, but that's all one can do sometimes as an emotional defense. I want to put a pin in the theme of unqualified hacks because I badly want to return to it later. But one of the things that you're suggesting here that I think is, I don't know, I'd like to get your view on it, is you see what happened to Eric Siebert, the career prosecutor who declined to prosecute James Comey because there was a lack of evidence. We will all cross our fingers for Elizabeth Usey at this point because you can see the writing on the wall there. At some point, though, you see officers of the court saying, we are admitted under the bar. We've taken oaths. We have professional obligations. We have obligations to the court that we have to uphold. And on top of that, on top of these incidents with prosecutors, you're also seeing a growing judicial record that is providing some really stark pushback to everything Trump is doing. And what I ultimately want to ask you here is, does that matter as these legal questions percolate upward toward the Supreme Court? So you noted the rulings from Trump-appointed judge, which shouldn't be relevant, but it's worth mentioning these days, Karen Immergut, who in no uncertain terms slapped back the assertions made by Trump's attorneys. Talk about having obligations as officers of the court, untethered to facts. This is from a non-legal perspective, this was a remarkable slapback. And then you have a ruling And I'll just quote here from a post on the Blue Amp, our mutual friend, all the people in the chat community who are used to viewing Cliff Schechter at this time on Blue Amp. The former MSNBC anchor David Schuster also writes on that site. He just wrote about a searing 161-page opinion from Massachusetts-based Judge William Young, a Reagan appointee. And I'll just quote very briefly from it. The president's palpable misunderstanding that the government simply cannot seek retribution for speech he disdains poses a great threat to Americans' freedom of speech. The court has listened carefully to the reasons given by, this was the case of the Tufts student who was renditioned off the streets by masked ICE agents, has listened carefully to the reasons given for masking up and has heard the same reasons advanced by the defendant, the acting director of ICE. It rejects his testimony as disingenuous, squalid, and dishonorable. And he goes on. So back to the question to you. Does any of this matter if all of this percolates up through the system to the Supreme Court? Does this kind of a judicial record of disdain for the judiciary branch ultimately weigh matters against Trump, or is this a completely unmoored Supreme Court at this point? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I always have to answer these kind of institutionally based questions in two ways. The way the law is supposed to work and the way I saw it work for 30 years from the inside, it absolutely matters, because once a litigant has shown himself to be willing to mislead the court, willing to ignore their duties as, quote, officers of the court, and I don't want to get distracted on this little dalliance, but when you use that term, and when Judge Immergut kept using that term, talking to DOJ lawyer Eric Hamilton, sir, you're an officer of the court. That's a really nice way of, and it's code for saying you are lying to me. You are not fulfilling your obligation as an officer of the court to be candid and accurate and truthful with me. And of course, Eric Hamilton, who's a political flunky that they keep sending in to courtrooms to misrepresent things to the judge, he's already been referred to his bar counsel. I believe he belongs to two bars. I want to say maybe Florida and DC, or New York and DC. He's been referred by a watchdog, an ethics watchdog group, for an ethical investigation. You're losing credibility as a litigant. And Donald Trump is the litigant, in essence, in all these cases. Donald Trump has wrestled away command and control of the Department of Justice from Pam Bondi. He is the de facto prosecutor, making all prosecutorial decisions, that DOJ has to make. So you lose credibility, you lose the goodwill that the judges are ordinarily willing to give the executive branch, DOJ lawyers, when they're arguing in court. And more important, you're losing, in my opinion, the presumption of regularity. That's a fancy term for, we generally will give the benefit of the doubt to the executive branch through its DOJ lawyers who appear in federal court, that they're being straight, they're being honest, and that their positions are in the best interest of the American people. You're losing all of that. We're going to presumption of regularity ourselves to death, the death of our democracy, if we're not careful. So that's my real world assessment. But as you mentioned, with this compromised Supreme Court, they are forever willing to do Donald Trump a solid by expanding his power in ways that run contrary to the Constitution, the balance of power, co-equal branches of government. They are allowing him to usurp, to steal the power of Congress in rulings that are completely inexplicable to me. And I know they say, well, we're only doing this on a preliminary basis. We haven't really gotten to the meat and the merits of the claim yet. But when all of the lower court judges, trial court judges, and courts of appeal tee up an issue for you with hundreds of pages of legal analysis, here is Judge William Young's opinion that you just mentioned, and I want to highlight a couple things in there.
Please do, please.
When you have all of the lower court federal judges issue 161 page opinions that thoughtfully sort of curate all of the facts and findings and apply the law, including Supreme Court precedent. And they say Donald Trump is violating the law and the Constitution. And then the Supreme Court on the shadow docket with no analysis says, we don't think so. That's so corrosive to the operation of the federal judiciary, because all of these judges are left adrift, not knowing why the law doesn't apply. And the Supreme Court, its own precedent, doesn't really apply. So they are now adrift. And I think it has a chilling effect on them. So in the legal upside down in which we are living, it's impossible to assess what it means when DOJ lawyers repeatedly go into court and mislead, misrepresent, fail in their duties to be officers of the court. But it is not only Trump-appointed judges who are ruling and ruling hard and calling out Donald Trump. Judge Immergut, I feel like you, and I think you kind of threw a caveat in there, like it shouldn't matter who appointed a judge. I agree with you. And in my 30 years as a prosecutor, never once did I ask, who appointed this judge? Not once. And yet here we are. And when you look at Judge Immergut's background, she is a hardcore, longtime Republican, including being on Kenneth Starr's independent counsel investigation of Bill Clinton. I mean, it seems like she had her very strong beliefs, and yet her beliefs in the Constitution are even stronger when she rules hard against Donald Trump. Now, going to the opinion of Judge William Young, who was appointed by President Ronald Reagan and authored that 161-page opinion, and it is unlike anything I've ever seen. It opens with him reproducing an anonymous postcard.
You've never seen that before. That is unprecedented.
Never seen this. He reproduces an anonymous postcard he received in chambers, and he quotes it as saying, "Trump has pardons and tanks. What do you have?" And then he answers that anonymous postcard writer on the first page of opinion. He says, "Dear Mr. or Miss Anonymous, alone, I have nothing but my sense of duty. Together, we the people, you and me, we have our magnificent Constitution. Here's how that works out in a specific case." And on page 161, he does a callback and says, "I hope this helped. Please come see us in action sometime in court." I mean, it gives me justice goosebumps for real when I see this. But then you know what he did, beautiful, Matt, which after he rules hard against Donald Trump and expressly says Kristi Noem and Marco Rubio worked hard and in concert with their own agency officials to deprive people of their First Amendment free speech rights and their right to assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievances. And he said, and you know what? We're going to be having a hearing on what the remedy, what the punishment might be. That's still in the offing. But the last 12 pages, I urge everybody to read at least the last 12 pages of the judge's opinion, because he starts that dozen pages with the heading, "Justice in the Trump Era." And he has subsections that are labeled, Trump, ignores everything, meaning the advice lawyers are giving him that what he's doing is unconstitutional. He has a section called, "And he keeps bullying on." And he has a section called simply retribution. I mean, I have never seen a judge take an administration or an executive branch official, and certainly not a president, to task so directly. But listen, the judiciary is standing strong. The judiciary is a point of light. I know, but the Supreme Court, I get it. We'll have to keep contending with them. But, I like what I see coming out of the lower federal courts.
I think it's worth, since we've both mentioned it, stinging the point about Judge Immergut being Trump appointee. And we're saying this, okay, we're gilding the lily a little bit, but it's also, in my mind, to say that not all the Trump appointees are Eileen Cannon. They're not all hacks. They're not all completely bending any sense of morality, ethics, and professional responsibility to their political whatever, their political loyalty. Republican Senator Al Simpson of Wyoming used to say that integrity is all that matters. He said it was true in Washington, but it's really true everywhere. If you have it, that's all that matters. And if you don't have it, That's all that matters. And to me, I no longer care if William Young was Reagan appointed, not a political hero of mine, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I don't care if he was Reagan appointed. What I care about is, do you have integrity? That's becoming all I really care about in politics as well. I want to throw an idea at you because you hinted that you're feeling perhaps a little bit less optimism today. I want to throw my thesis at you for why I'm feeling some optimism. And I hope you won't mind indulging me for just a minute to lay this out. Because I want to see how it washes with you from a legal perspective. It goes back to an article I wrote for Newsweek this past November called "A Hidden Catch-22 That Could Ruin Donald Trump's Plans." And what I wrote was, agencies can't just do what their heads or the president wants. And for all of the dismay over some pretty wild-eyed characters getting nominated to lead major government functions, the ability to push Trump's agenda largely rests on the capabilities of the people in the layers below. And if Trump wants his agenda, he's going to need these people. He's going to need the deep state. Yes, that's a good time to Google irony. These people, for the most part, are actually very good at their jobs. And the problem with replacing competent professionals is that you get incompetent amateurs. So what happens when he backfills all of those jobs with Trump stands whose major qualification is filling out a loyalty questionnaire? Is it possible, likely even, that the answer is going to paraphrase that 1970s anthem, "Clowns to the right of me, jokers to the further right"? And what I essentially postulated, and I think the track record over the first 9 months has borne this out, at least a little, is that the reason that these kinds of autocratic government setups that have so much of this kind of hacksterism embedded in them, the reason that they fail is that they get dragged down by the Peter principle. And you get people in positions of incompetence. The Atlantic just reported that ICE detentions have stalled out since the one big beautiful bill gave ICE $45 billion. Gave them $45 billion, but they can't detain more people. And that's because of administrative incompetence. It's because they have hacks. So let me ask you about all of this from a legal angle. As you see these kinds of rulings, Judge Immerget, Judge Young,
Judge Coffenauer.
Yeah. And the competent prosecutors getting fired for refusing to prosecute groundlessly. Do you see the same kind of catch-22 biting Trump? And is his hollowing out of legal competence starting to boomerang back on him?
Yeah, one of the things that, and it's almost like you've heard what I've been preaching for many, many months. I take great comfort in the belief that these imbeciles and incompetents and lapdogs and flunkies don't have what it takes to end American democracy. They can cause a lot of mischief. They can do a lot of harm to a lot of people, whether on the health front, whether wrongfully terminating people who are then forced to decide, do I spend the next 2 years fighting this wrongful termination in court? They're going to inflict a lot of harm. They've inflicted a fair amount of it, and they're going to inflict more. We are nowhere near rock bottom, I fear, but I don't think this batch of incompetents and imbeciles and flunkies have what it takes to end American democracy. I've been saying for months, this will implode. I don't know when it will implode. I don't know what the implosion will look like. And I don't know how much harm they will do to the American people before the implosion comes. But it will implode. I'm thrilled to hear about that ICE statistic. I hadn't heard that. But that makes sense to me. You can't put a bunch of incompetents and imbeciles into these jobs and expect they will succeed at what they're trying to accomplish. They won't. And then it's going to be up to all of us to not only see what rises up from the ashes of the implosion, but to be part of the rebuild, and I can only hope that, we once again have a strong, viable, honest, rule of law centric Republican Party, maybe headed up by Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. I don't know. I disagree with their politics, but goodness knows when they said American democracy is more important than my reelection prospects. And yet we only have 2 Republicans like that. The rest of them in Congress have laid down and given it all away to the bully without a fight. You know, maybe they become the leadership of what rises up from the Trump implosion, but I'm with you, Matt. This will implode. You can't keep sending DOJ lawyers who don't know what the hell they're doing. Many of them apparently have no ethical grounding, because that's not sustainable in court. It's just not. So the implosion is coming. I hope it comes sooner rather than later, but I think we have a lot of pain between now and implosion day.
For those joining late, which is always the case with live streaming, because people get it, they're busy, they have their lives to live, and then they see the email on Substack or they get the notification on YouTube and they jump on. We are talking to Glenn Kirschner, who was the model. I understand it. This is a rumor that I'm starting for Tom Cruise's character in A Few Good Men, and now is a legal eagle on TV independently. All right. I want to get to, I don't know if this is fun, but we're going to treat it as fun because it's so outrageous and ridiculous. And it's so of the moment. We have to go there. We have to talk about Pam Bondi's, unhinged, insane appearance before the Senate Judiciary Committee today. I have a couple of clips for those of you who have actually been living your lives in a meaningful way and not obsessing about the crap that Pam Bondi says. To set it up, there's an old adage among lawyers. You know this better than I do. I'm not a lawyer. The adage says, if you have the facts on your side, pound the facts. If you have the law on your side, pound the law. If you have neither the facts nor the law, pound the table. Now, South Park did a version of this a few years ago, explaining what the acronym DARVO means. Deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. And it's 19 seconds. It's worth watching. I hope people will indulge me in this. It's worth watching as a setup.
Victim and offender. All right, let's role play. You be your accusers and I'll be you. You illegally damage property and make your business. You damage property to make your business more profitable, you lying sack of shit. I'm not going to be bullied by you. See? It's really not that hard. Just takes a little chin wag.
Okay. So with that in mind, I would like to play 2 clips from Attorney General of the United States of America. Let's remember that at all times. The Attorney General of the United States of America, Pamela Bondi. If people can make it through this without vomiting. Here we go.
New border czar, now border czar, Tom Homan, was videotaped taking a bag with $50,000 in cash from undercover FBI agents after suggesting he could help with government contracts. Sounds like a bribe. 2 weeks ago, DOJ officials reportedly shut down the bribery investigation into Mr. Homan. Ms. Bondi, did you approve closing the Homan investigation, bribery investigation?
Senator Hirono, as I stated earlier, the Department of Justice and the FBI conducted a thorough review, and they found no credible evidence of any wrongdoing. You were also on video outside the White House protesting with a group called CASA, where Antifa members were. Does that mean you're a member of Antifa?
There's been public reporting that Jeffrey Epstein showed people photos of President Trump with half-naked young women. Do you know if the FBI found those photographs in their search of Jeffrey Epstein's safe or premises or otherwise? Have you seen any such thing?
You know, Senator Whitehouse, you sit here and make salacious remarks, once again trying to slander President Trump left and right, when you're the one who was taking money from one of Epstein's closest confidants, I believe, I could be wrong, correct me, Reid Hoffman. who was with Jeffrey Epstein on multiple occasions. And the
Out of order. You're out of order. The whole system's out of order. Glenn, what did you make of that?
You know, Pam Bondi is behaving like Donald Trump's consigliere, the dirty mob lawyer that she's comporting herself to be. You know, one of the things I had the good fortune to do as a prosecutor in DC is be involved in trying the largest RICO prosecution, racketeer influenced and corrupt organizations prosecution in the history of the DC courts. I know a criminal enterprise when I see one. And Donald Trump is running the executive branch like a mob outfit, like a criminal organization, like a RICO gang. And he's got, you know, his dirty mob lawyer in Pam Bondi, the way she's behaving, which is not a surprise. She came in on day one with an enemies list, said, I'm going to be investigating, you know, Jack Smith and his staff and Alvin Bragg and Tish James and this one and that one and this, you know, which is the exact opposite of what an attorney general should do. She should say, I'm going to come in, I'm going to follow the facts and apply the law wherever they may lead without fear or favor. You don't come in with an enemies list. The FBI director has a deep state list in his book, Government Gangsters, and the Washington Post, I think, accurately calls that an enemies list. And now he is executing on his plan to go after Trump's enemies. I mean, we don't have a legitimate government. And Pam Bondi, I think, proved that even just in that clip where she's incapable of answering a direct question from a United States senator. And I saw Sheldon Whitehouse ask her other questions as well earlier today. Like, I want you to answer the question, did Tom Homan get to keep the $50,000 of undercover FBI money that he accepted, or did you require him to give it back when you concluded he did nothing wrong, which doesn't make any sense? Did he report that $50,000, assuming you let him keep it because he did nothing wrong? Did he report it on his tax returns? These are questions the American people deserve answers to. And she did the humana, you know, well, no, but you once, you know, didn't pay a parking ticket. I mean, it's such unbelievable horseshit.
As a prosecutor, do you start tenting your fingers when you have a defendant starting down that path? Like, oh yeah, oh, I've got you. I mean, it really is. And by the way, I have to point out, not that we need to go back to the video, but you know, anyone watching this later, go back to her response to the question from Senator Hirono, where she takes a long pause and references her binder and starts flipping. It is not because she needs to look up what happened in the Homan case. What she's looking for is the prepared zinger, the accusation that she's going to lob back. She has been briefed. How do I know this? Because I'm a former staffer. I spent 10 years staffing members of Congress. This is what you do. You prepare a binder with, it's like a choose your own adventure book. If you get to this point, this is what you plug in. Let's go to something that you said a moment ago. This is where I put a pin in this, put it in the parking lot a little bit earlier. And it's been pretty hot in the chats. This question of accountability. You know, is all of this going to bend back? You pointed out your experience as a RICO prosecutor, and that essentially Trump, talk about the Darvo of all time. He has made it a leitmotif to call former President Biden and his family the Biden crime family. Of course, you accuse people of that which you yourself are guilty, and he is running a criminal enterprise. And I wrote about this on Worth Knowing on my Substack a couple of weeks ago, pointing out that FBI Director Kash Patel, about a third of his $6 million net worth came from consulting contracts for Trump's companies, and most of the rest came from a consulting contract with a Cayman Islands-based company, that sounds legit, that turns out to be the parent company for the controversial Chinese fast fashion company Shine. And it started in April of 2024 and came with a stock grant worth between $1 million and $5 million. There's a very similar story going on with Pam Bondi. I won't belabor it, but between the prosecutorial and the investigative arm of our system of justice, he has sewed up a corrupt enterprise with leaders who have deep financial ties and dependency on him. So all of this raises the question of accountability. Now, you said on your must listen to, must watch live stream last night, I will go ahead and once again pop up the plug for your Substack. It truly is must watch. You said that someday we will be able to and need to hold all these people accountable. And one of the problems with Darvoing is that it's so confusing in a democracy. And this whole Bondi appearance this morning is calculated to muddy the waters, not just by Darvoing against each individual accuser, but also the broader thing of saying, we're not the ones who weaponized the DOJ. You weaponized the DOJ. You did. Witch hunt, hoax. You wiretapped the president. I mean, by the way, another Glenn who's very prominent on Substack, Glenn Kessler, the former WAPO fact checker, wrote about all of this. He wrote, there's literally no evidence for any of this. If anything, you could argue that Biden's Justice Department was cautious to a fault. So it's insane BS. So I guess my first question is, especially because Trump is surely going to pardon proactively all of these people, how can these people who are part of a Trump criminal enterprise, how can we someday hold them accountable?
If we are unwilling to litigate the validity of a presidential pardon that is delivered as part of an ongoing conspiracy, and DOJ, when it is again in the hands of law-abiding and constitutional allegiant leadership, will have to make decisions about what kind of cases they can pursue and what kind of cases the Supreme Court has made it impossible for them to pursue, given their horrific presidential immunity ruling. I was hopeful that after Donald Trump left office the first time, that we would recognize the importance of holding him and all of his criminal associates accountable for their attempted destruction of American democracy. And it turns out that Merrick Garland's DOJ was not up to that task. They got started too late. They let Congress take the lead and embarrass them by putting on a really blockbuster series of hearings, the January 6th House Select Committee public hearings. And then DOJ was prodded into wakefulness and said, boy, I guess there were some crimes here we need to get after. And, it all unraveled, I think, first under a compromised Trump-appointed Judge Aileen Cannon. Donald Trump should be serving a prison sentence for the classified documents, obstruction of justice, espionage crimes for which he was indicted federally down in Florida, because those crimes don't enjoy presidential immunity. He committed them after he left the White House, and those were ongoing offenses down there. But we weren't up to the task. We didn't move out quickly enough on those crimes. And now the Supreme Court has ruled, contrary to the Constitution, that a president who has a constitutional obligation to take care to faithfully execute the laws of the nation is permitted to violate all the laws of the nation and victimize the American people with complete immunity from prosecution. I'm not a textualist or an originalist, but that one seems pretty clear, not to mention the impeachment judgment clause that says in substance, you can impeach a president in the House. You can convict the president in the Senate on the articles of impeachment and remove him from office, and he can still be prosecuted. How do you contort that into an argument that the Constitution dictates that a president can't be prosecuted? There are two examples. I always quote Professor Akil Reed Amar, one of our preeminent constitutional scholars, Yale law professor, who said in the case of Trump versus United States, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution is unconstitutional. Where do we go from there? We can't appeal a bad Supreme Court decision. So you can see that I'm avoiding answering your question. Will we be able to hold folk accountable? All I can say is, once we have come out of the darkness and the rule of law comes back into the light, if the Department of Justice does not go scorched earth, honestly, ethically, in accordance with the evidence, doesn't go scorched earth after everybody who has committed the crimes that we see being committed in the harsh light of day by Trump and his executive branch flunkies, then shame on us. Then we don't get to keep our republic. We're giving it all away. But I wish I were more optimistic and I could say, you bet they're all going to be held accountable. It is going to be an uphill slog, on the road to accountability, but it has to be undertaken. Win, lose, or draw. It has to be undertaken. We saw the J6 crimes committed with our own eyes. We heard Donald Trump urge from a platform of lies, which is what provides evidence of corrupt intent, which is not as hard to prove, take it from this old prosecutor, as people pretend it is or might think it is. He said, your election was stolen, your vote was taken from you, the whole thing was rigged. Now go to the Capitol, fight like hell, or you won't have a country anymore. Now go stop the certification, stop the steal. That's inciting a riot, plain and simple. No First Amendment protection for speech that is designed to and likely to result in imminent violence. And boy, did we see imminent violence. Rudy Giuliani, his little sidekick, who's now a member of the disbarred Donald Trump Lawyers Club, as Lindsey Halligan and others will go that way eventually. He said, let's go have trial by combat. Come on, you knuckleheads. These are easy crimes to prove. But we weren't up to the task, were we? And then once he got back into power, he pardoned everybody. He's trying to make the criminals the cops and the cops the criminals. And he wants all of this upheaval because amidst all the upheaval, he's grifting, he's enriching himself, and his buddies are doing the same. And if we don't hold them accountable, shame on us.
I will pick up on that just very quickly to say that our guest last week, the Stanford professor Adam Bonica, also a prolific Substacker, has been making this argument that the corruption angle is politically is the way to go. And my friendly amendment to that was, it's a contrast argument. To me, it's corruption. You didn't vote for this. What you voted for was to lower the price of eggs. What you voted for was stronger border. You voted for, feels like the Democrats maybe got a little woke there. Let's dial that back 5%. You didn't vote for him to enrich himself by $10 billion, which is the latest figure according to Forbes, through the course of his presidency, while your prices went up, your bills went up, your jobs evaporated. I want to ask you just two more, and I'll give people the programming note that we are very fortunate to have Glenn with us, so we're not going to overstretch him at all. Supreme Court just began its newest term. What are you watching most?
I am keenly interested in every Trump-related case that they accept review of, because they seem to be willing to allow him to expand his presidential power in ways that seem kind of blatantly either unlawful in violation of federal statutes or unconstitutional in violation of separation of powers and the whole co-equal brain, our whole construct of governance, right? And if they continue to do that, even recognizing that he deserves to lose the presumption of regularity, he doesn't deserve any benefit of any argument because of the way he is behaving and being called out by lower federal court judges. If they continue on that path for reasons that are inexplicable to me, then I don't know if we can win, if we can keep our republic. So I'm going to watch every Trump-related case that bubbles up, because thus far the Supreme Court has been the weakest of the federal judicial courts to deal with Trump's lawlessness and unconstitutionality, which are two different but related things.
And I'll point out that according to it's not a fully up-to-date analysis, Trump has won 85% of his cases at the Supreme Court level. But where most cases end up, where the buck stops most of the time, is one level below that. And there, Trump has lost about 2/3 of his cases. And at the district court level, one cut below that, where a substantial portion of cases end, he's lost even more handily, or is in the course of losing. And we're beginning to develop more of these stinging opinions, these absolute rebukes. And I have to hope, I know there was a little bit of cold water on this earlier. I have to hope that this growing record of conservative judges or Republican appointed issuing these kinds of rulings has got to aggregate at some point. There has to be a message that filters up to the Supreme Court. Let me get you out of here on this. We started with optimism. You made a very interesting and probably apt distinction last night on your Substack live stream between optimism and hope. Optimism, I guess, I'm not sure I heard the definition, but I guess optimism is hope grounded in evidence. At this point, you mentioned the roller coaster that we're all on. What would increase your optimism? What would decrease it? But more importantly, what would increase it?
A couple of things. One would be seeing a couple of rulings from the Supreme Court that evinced a loyalty to the Constitution that I think has been lacking. What I will say is, John Sauer, Donald Trump's former criminal defense lawyer, now his Solicitor General, is probably doing a pretty good job of picking and choosing what cases he's trying to bubble up to the Supreme Court to give them that 85% win. I don't think they're going to take the cases where he extorted law firms, and said, lawyers and law firms that displease me, you all are prohibited from entering federal courthouses. I mean, that's just asinine and blatantly unconstitutional, which is a quote from John Coffenauer in the birthright citizenship case. So they're not going to push the outrageous cases up to the Supreme Court, because then he runs the risk of losing more in the Supreme Court. So, but that's more hope than optimism, that the Supreme Court will get its head out of its judicial you-know-what and begin to actually pay attention to the express terms of the Constitution. What will give me hope is if the American people continue to rise up in ever increasing numbers, because I have been saying for a very long time, and I think we've learned the hard way, that no one person is going to save us. No one, lawyer, no one prosecutor, no one judge, certainly no one politician. If the Dems could have saved us, they would have saved us already. They can't. And I know we get frustrated for what sometimes seems like a lack of effort and creativity and piss and vinegar. But it's kind of always been up to us, and it will always be up to us to save us, right? And you often hear, I'm no autocracy expert, but I hear the experts talk about that 3.5% target of, if you get 3.5% of the population rising up.
Professor Erica Chenoweth, I've invited you. Come on. I know you're working on a book. Come on to the show. We keep talking about this.
We can do it. We can do it. And there are, I would just encourage everybody to engage in any way you can engage. Some people are like, I'm not comfortable going to protests, or I'm not into calling my elected officials. I would urge you to do all of those things. But, get involved in postcard writing. My wife does that, and it makes you feel good, and it has an impact, right? Support this. This is a big push that I've made. consider supporting, not just donating money to candidates. And I don't want to, poo-poo that because it's important. How about you consider supporting with donations or in-kind help all of the nonprofit organizations that go into court every day and fight for our rights? Do you realize when the Supreme Court came down, I don't want to overstay my welcome, and I do have another commitment coming up, but I've mentioned John Coffenauer a few times. He is a federal court judge, again, appointed under Ronald Reagan, who had one of the first blockbuster opinions calling Donald Trump out. It was when Donald Trump tried to pick up a Sharpie with his tiny little hand and cross out of the Constitution the guarantee of birthright citizenship. And Judge John Coffenauer said, first of all, where were the lawyers in the room? Well, the problem is they're dirty lawyers who are, facilitating Donald Trump's unconstitutional executive orders. But he then said that, quote, this is blatantly unconstitutional. And that went up to the Supreme Court. And what did the Supreme Court do? They found a procedural reason to make it okay for Donald Trump, at least in the interim, to deny people their birthright, as Judge William Young just announced. And they said, that's because we don't like nationwide injunctions anymore. No more nationwide injunctions for you, which is really asinine, in my opinion, because the litigant in the birthright citizenship case proved that she would be harmed by Donald Trump's unconstitutional attempt to cancel that constitutional provision. She won and was winning in the courts, but the court said, yeah, but we don't think everybody should have the protection of a nationwide injunction. We, I guess, want everybody to get their own lawyer if they have the means and go in one by one, thousands and millions of them, to reach the same result that one plaintiff just reached in the case in which she won. And so there were 4 nonprofit organizations, Matt, that the minute that the no nationwide injunctions for you, which I always have Jerry Seinfeld soup Nazi quote, no soup for you, no nationwide injunctions for you. I know that, sorry. These 4 nonprofits ran into court, and because the Supreme Court left the door cracked to using a different procedural vehicle to get to the same result, the four nonprofits that ran into court and protected our rights, the Democracy Defenders Fund, Norm Eisen's group, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Asian Law Caucus, and the ACLU, they sprinted into court. They got a class certified that protects all infants born on or after February 20th, 2025, the date Donald Trump tried to take that Sharpie and X that right out of the Constitution. All infants born or yet to be born are now part of a protected class. Do you realize those are 4 of probably more than 100 nonprofits that are in court every day fighting for our rights? But we don't pay them. We don't retain them. Technically, they're not our lawyers, but they're fighting for our rights. If you don't want to donate, call them up. They could use all kinds of help. I don't know, maybe you're an accountant. Maybe you want to go make copies. Maybe you want to do a door knocking campaign to help support them. These are the lawyers that are fighting, because DOJ lawyers aren't fighting for us anymore. It is the nonprofits that are fighting for the rights of the American people. So that's a great way to engage in a way that maybe doesn't put you out there, and you have to experience the discomfort of marching and protesting and speaking out, and, but everybody needs to engage. Everybody needs to engage. That is where I draw my optimism from, because no King's Day coming up, October 18th. I mean, we're going to get out there. We're going to do it bigger than we did it last time. I'll be speaking at our local chapter here in Northern Virginia. Everybody's got to get into the game. I say justice is a team sport. Everybody needs to be in the game.
With you running the third 100, I'm going to take the baton from you and, like Usain Bolt, sprint us to the close here, because we do have to get you out of here. And I want to really amplify that final point that you just so brilliantly made. What gives me hope is the fact that we have 3 sources of power, even up against this behemoth that we seemingly confront. I got hope from the Disney reaction. We have economic power, and if we target it, it is effective as hell. So let's keep doing that. Sinclair, you're next. We have legal power, And the point you were just making, it's not just those of us who are attorneys. There's a good friend of mine, longtime listener, was just saying over the weekend, what's happened to our civil society? Well, you're pointing out the nonprofits and legal advocacy organizations that are in the trenches fighting for our rights and the rights of our children and grandchildren every single day, and we can surely support them. Civil society, nonprofits, advocacy organizations. And finally, yes, we still retain political power. For those who subscribe to my Substack, Worth Knowing, or my podcast, you will hear my old friend who's running for Bucks County DA in Pennsylvania in an area that Trump won by he's ahead by 6 points right now, the Democrat. We can win races like that, and we surely have to. In Pennsylvania, the entire slate of Supreme Court justices is up on the ballot. Will they be retained? That's a race that Democrats can win, and it's another bulwark against the creeping authoritarianism that we're seeing from the Trump administration. So don't let the current environment drain you of hope and optimism, because we actually have levers to pull on, and they are powerful, and so are we collectively. I have to thank Glenn Kirschner for this extraordinary window into his very keen mind, and I mean his career as Tom Cruise, which is highly laudable. All of your info is up on the screen. The glennkirschner.substack.com Substack, absolutely must read and must view. And I am Matt Robeson, worthknowing.substack.com. I will see everyone next week. Really looking forward to it. We've got a great slate of guests upcoming. And Glenn, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Matt.
All right, everyone, stay safe, be well, and we'll see you soon.